Playing with Fire by Isles of Woe. A fan work based on the All for the Game series by Nora Sakavic. Chapter 2. Carson didn't want to think about what she'd just done, but wanting to do something and actually doing it were two very different things. A deep, acidic guilt had already burrowed its way into her chest during Coach Wilde's pitch, and it lingered even after she'd signed her name on the dotted line. Part of Carson worried that she was moving too quickly. She jumped headfirst into a life-changing decision without giving it even half an hour of thought. But she knew there was a very good chance that she'd panic and back out if she waited. Carson didn't let herself dwell on that ache between her ribs, though. If she'd said no, if she gave all of this up, just as it came within her reach, she knew she would never be able to forgive herself. She just hoped her mother would see it that way when she found out. And she would find out, eventually. Amelia James was many things, but she was far from stupid. It may not be for weeks, months, if Carson was lucky, but once her mother knew that Carson had signed with a collegiate XE team behind her back, all hell would break loose. Bonus damnation points if she found out Carson had already been playing for 3 years. Extra hellfire if she knew that she'd signed with the Foxes of all teams. Carson tried to tally the timeline of her mother wising up to her lie as she stripped off her gear for the night. Keeping practices and games from her would be easy now that the season was over. If she was careful, Carson could ride that wave all the way to May. She was at least planning on towing the line of acceptability by staying in Colorado for part of the summer until she was meant to arrive in South Carolina with the rest of the team in June. How she would get there would be tricky, though. She would have to come up with a foolproof plan to get to the airport without suspicion. Coach Wildes left almost as soon as Carson had sealed her fate with that contract, seemingly sensing that Carson was on the verge of spontaneously combusting the longer she lingered. Even without the weight of the woman's gaze, Carson's fingers shook as she opened her locker. She blew out a hard breath to try and steady herself before depositing her gear and pulling on her clothes. She hadn't bothered to shower. Arriving home unwashed after a match was a gamble, but it was ultimately one that Carson was willing to take, given the circumstances. The school was closing for the night, and she'd just end up walking home in early March. Carson would take the risk, if it meant not getting locked in the gym or freezing to death. She resigned herself to her grimy, rumpled fate. Though that did mean passing under her mother's trouble meter would come with an additional set of challenges. Looking in the mirror was never her favorite, but Carson had to make sure she looked like she'd been studying all day instead of busting her ass across the court like a common thug, to use her mother's words. Her clothes were okay, if a bit disheveled from being balled at the bottom of her locker for most of the evening. Carson's hair, on the other hand, was another story. She usually kept it in a tight braid for matches, but a combination of wearing her helmet and a couple of particularly nasty body checks had left it a sweaty wreck. It hung in dark brown tangles around her face and down her back, doing its best to look more like a clump of brambles than hair. It was too knotted to fix completely, and another braid was out of the question, but if she pulled it into a tight enough bun, it might have been seen as presentable. If her mother didn't look too closely, that is. Sometimes Carson wished she could just shave it all off and save herself the hassle. She envied Danielle's ability to wear short hair like it was nothing. She wondered if she would ever get to that point as well. Carson couldn't help but laugh at the image of herself walking through the front door with her hair shorn within an inch of her scalp. Her mother would have an aneurysm. Finally, Carson splashed some cool water on her face to try and reduce the lingering flush in her cheeks and schooled her expression into a calm, if tired look. The effect wasn't perfect, but if she played her cards right, she might just manage to attribute her harried appearance to a particularly stressful school day. It would have to do. She spared a glance at her watch, ignoring the tug of nausea in her gut at how late it had gotten, and forced herself to leave the locker room before she could make any more stupid decisions. Tonight's rebellion was enough to last her a decade at least. The late winter air hit Carson as soon as the heavy door of the gym slammed shut behind her. The sun had gone down hours earlier, and the frigid wind was merciless on Carson's bare fingers and cheeks. Wildes had left the folder she'd brought for Carson. It hadn't just contained the blank contract. The coach had filled it with everything Carson would need between tonight and when practices started up in June. including class registration details and a one-way plane ticket to South Carolina. It was as if she'd known Carson wouldn't, or couldn't, say no. Carson was still clutching the folder now. She almost didn't want to let go of it. What if it simply ceased to exist once it was out of her sight? Carson still couldn't quite get herself to believe that this wasn't all just a crazy dream. This singular stack of papers was the first thread of hope in her life in so long, she couldn't remember what that felt like to even be hopeful. She was going to cling to that feeling until her nails bit into her palms and her fingers went numb from the effort. Carson took a deep breath, ignoring the way the icy air bit at her lungs, allowing herself one more good look at the Foxpaw logo shining just beneath her name. A small smile crept onto her lips, and she shoved the folder as far down into her bag as it would go before making the half-mile trek home. It was a risk, bringing all of that contraband home, but it didn't feel right to leave it at the school where she couldn't see it and know that it was real. Even with the folder nestled beneath her schoolwork, Carson had to fight to keep from checking that it was still there the entire way home. Despite the looming threat of her mother catching sight of her prize, she knew she'd made the right call. Carson was shivering by the time she made it to her front door. She'd put her hood up before leaving the gym, and it had helped to block out some of the frigid wind, but the brutal chill still seeped into her bones in the 10 minutes it took Carson to get home. She couldn't bring herself to mind all that much, though. Her daily walk to and from school was about as much freedom as her peers got by getting their driver's licenses, and she would take her few allowances where she could get them. Inconveniences be damned. The lights were on inside the small house, throwing golden rectangles into the winter-crisped grass that Carson had to dodge in order to stay hidden. She mounted the steps quickly and quietly. Pausing at the door, Carson peered through the old, warped glass before proceeding. It was never wise to barge into the James home without first assessing what lay ahead. She could just see her mother at her usual spot in the dining room, head bent over her work laptop. Carson was positive that she'd missed dinner, but if her mom wasn't glancing out a window every few minutes or waiting by the door to ambush her, that was always a good sign. It was worth standing in the cold for a few additional seconds if it meant she knew whether tonight would be the end of her short life. Even so, Carson winced at the groan of the old door announcing her arrival when she finally decided it was safe to come inside. "Hi, Mama," Carson called. The term felt childish in Carson's mouth, but her mother liked when she called her that. She hoped using the name would keep her off her back long enough for Carson to get to her room and hide the contraband that felt like it was searing a hole through the bottom of her bag. She had to give the door a hard shove to get it to close properly behind her, so she didn't catch the expression on her mother's face when she looked up from her work. "Carson, you're home," her mother said, her tone too sweet to be anything but artificial. "Late?" a mocking voice said from the shadows of the darkened living room. Carson tried and failed to ignore the irritation that flared between her ears. "Isaac!" she hissed, shooting a glare his way. Her brother was lounging in his favorite indent on the couch, beer in hand and ESPN muted on the TV across from him. The screen gave him a sickly blue cast, despite the warmth of the dining room's lights just a few feet in front of him. He gave her a cool look, taking another swig of his drink and opting to stay silent, as if he cared how late Carson stayed out. As long as she held the position of the golden child, all of the scrutiny would fall on her. Any minor mistakes Carson made only helped to push her brothers further away from the spotlight. And now, thanks to Isaac, she had to work on damage control if she wanted to avoid the scorching gaze of their mother enough to survive the night. Carson did her best to wrestle her expression into a relaxed smile. "Yeah, sorry about that," she said, moving toward the table where her mother sat. "I have a big research paper due soon, and I lost track of time." It wasn't a complete lie, and her mother had a habit of keeping track of Carson's assignments, making it an easy card to pull. She did have a research paper to turn in. She'd finished it 2 days ago, but her mother didn't need to know that. She shrugged. "I didn't know the sun had gone down until the janitor made me leave." Carson remembered, belatedly, to straighten her shoulders as she came further into the light, keenly aware of her posture. Her mother's fingers slowed on the keyboard as Carson approached, and she paused to study her daughter more closely. Carson tried not to flinch away from her gaze, dread beginning to pool in her stomach. The patronizing look in her mother's eyes was a familiar, if disconcerting, sight. "Oh, honey," her mother said, voice already dripping with disapproval. She took Carson's chin between her fingers, tilting her head left and right. Carson tried not to freeze under her narrowed gaze as her mother picked apart her appearance. "You know I don't like you walking home so late. It's dangerous at night. And look at you. You're so cold your face is as blotchy as a Van Gogh." What if I like Van Gogh? Carson didn't say. The words had almost slipped out, but she managed to catch them on the tip of her tongue. Tonight's events had made her bold. She needed to shut that down as soon as possible. "I want you to call me next time so I can know to pick you up." "I like walking home, Mama. I was plenty safe, I promise," Carson said, keeping her eyes steady on her mother's. Her chin was still held in a firm grip, and she didn't want to think about what her mother would do if she misstepped. "It gives me time to work on my history." Not to mention the ire she'd receive if she pulled her mother away from her work long enough to drive Carson home. The mention of schoolwork seemed to distract her mother enough. "Your brother is right. Let's see if tonight's work reflects on your grade. Yes?" It was more of a threat than a question. "Get a good enough grade, and I'll forget about your tardiness." Carson nodded, but she was holding her breath. Her mother gave her a thin smile that failed to reach her eyes. Releasing her hold on Carson's face, she turned back to her laptop. Carson did her best not to let out an audible breath of relief. "You missed dinner. Leftovers are in the fridge. Eat them before you do anything else tonight." Carson made sure to turn her back on her mother before rolling her eyes, but she did as she was told. She was too wired to be hungry, even though the game night dinner she'd packed for herself hadn't exactly stayed in her stomach. To use her mother's words, Carson had to pick her battles, and this was a fight that was not worth the headache. God forbid her mother accuse her of hating her cooking, and if she suspected that Carson was starving herself, she would have an even bigger problem to deal with. Besides, if Carson ignored her nutritional needs, her condition would tip from severe anxiety to legitimate eating disorder, and that felt like one too many issues for her to handle. She dutifully ate her half-cold meal so quickly she couldn't even taste it. When she'd finished, Carson did her best to place her plate in the dishwasher as casually as possible to avoid drawing any more pointed attention to herself. And then, finally, Carson was free to retreat to the relative safety of her room. Her mother didn't look up from her work as Carson made her way deeper into the house, but she did raise her voice enough to let Carson know that she was clearly addressing her. "I wish you wouldn't wear your hair like that," she said, keys clacking away as if she'd mentioned something as unimportant as the weather. "Putting it up does nothing for you." Carson almost lost her balance in shock. The words hit her as if her mother had smacked an egg into the back of her skull, and now the slimy innards were dripping from her scalp down to her shoulders. Before she knew what she was doing, she'd spun around, her mouth already moving. "Mom!" she snapped, her hands balling into fists at her sides. Her mother, fingers abruptly stilling on the laptop's keys, turned to fix her with a dangerously blank stare. "Tone," she warned, her lips pressing thin. Carson's spine turned to ice, but her face felt way too hot. She wondered, not for the first time, if her mother simply hated the mere sight of her. Carson fought to keep her breathing even as she stood there, pinned like a bug under her mother's gaze. It was as if she had turned her to stone. Carson couldn't move, and her lungs were struggling under a solid weight. It felt like minutes had passed before her mother turned away from her again. She offered no other comment, no explanation. She just left Carson to stand there and stew. It wasn't uncommon for her mother to make pointed comments like that, but it stung every time she did. It took Carson a moment to get her feet moving again. The Jameses' house was small, 1 story and a basement with only 2 actual bedrooms to speak of. Carson's mother slept in one, and her brothers, Isaac and Anthony, shared the other. Or they used to before Anthony's arrest last July. A tiny office that was little more than a glorified closet had been made into Carson's bedroom. It sat at the back of the house, behind the kitchen, down a single step before the stairs to the back door, and the basement continued past it. Carson only had to walk about 10 feet to her door, but it might as well have been miles. She somehow managed to make it there without completely breaking apart, and shut the door as far as it would go. The thing didn't boast a lock, and it sat so crookedly in its hinges that it couldn't even close properly. But it offered more privacy than anything else in the house outside of the shared bathroom. Carson leaned against her sad little door for a moment and tried to get herself to breathe. Pausing to revel in her little bubble, she clutched her backpack to her chest as if it could help ground her, pressing the rough canvas into her fingertips. The folder at the bottom of her bag glowed like a fire in a blizzard, offering warmth and hope in the void that had swallowed her. She made a slow count to 10 before moving again. The room barely fit her thrifted twin bed, the dresser that doubled as a desk, and a tiny bookshelf pushed against the far wall that had long since overflown. It wasn't perfect, but it was as much of Carson's space as any other could be, and that fact helped Carson relax a small amount, at least. Carson swung her bag onto her bed a little more aggressively than she would have liked, and quickly fished out the folder. She wanted to stare at it again like she had before making her way back home. Her fingers itched to flip it open, to comb through every page, pamphlet, and document to prove to herself that it was real. She wanted so badly to paste the one-way plane ticket to South Carolina on her wall as a visible reminder of her future. Carson burned with that need so intensely it felt as if her flesh might melt completely off her bones. Instead, she shoved the entire stack between the box spring and her mattress, making sure to thoroughly smooth her bedding out once she was done. Carson's hiding places were few and far between, but she made do with what she had. She hoped it was enough to keep her secret for as long as she needed. She'd just gotten to her feet when her door creaked its way open, sending a jolt of adrenaline straight into her bloodstream. "Dude, what the hell?" Carson said in a harsh stage whisper when she turned to find Isaac leaning against the door frame, an unopened can of beer in his hands. He was smiling, and there was a cruel glint in his eyes. Carson wanted to rip the stupid look off his face, or, barring that, empty his fresh drink over his head, but she stood her ground. Isaac popped the tab and took a leisurely pull from the can before answering. "Don't let Mom hear you say that," he said with a smirk. His words slurred together slightly, tone-mocking. "Swears are for the uneducated." Carson scowled. "Like that's ever stopped you before." She'd learned most of her swears from him and Anthony. Of course, their mother didn't enforce that rule nearly as strictly with her sons as she did when it came to Carson. "What do you want?" "What, I can't check on my baby sister?" In the 18 years they had lived under the same roof, Isaac had never shown an ounce of concern for anyone without hiding something up his sleeve. Toying with people was his favorite pastime, and Carson was his easiest target. Their mother gave him plenty of ammo to work with. Carson's back was tense enough to snap. She took a step toward her brother in warning. "Get out," she said through clenched teeth. Isaac's eyes sparkled with interest, and he leaned in. "Oh," he crooned. He'd already had enough to drink that Carson could smell the sourness of the beer on his breath from a few feet away. "Does Mom's perfect princess have something to hide?" It took a Herculean effort for Carson not to let her eyes stray to where she'd stashed her folder. "Tell me more." Carson lunged. Isaac may have been half a foot taller than her and several pounds heavier, but her time on the court didn't amount to nothing. "Leave!" Isaac laughed even as he was shoved back onto the landing. Carson swung her door closed once again. She hoped she'd taken off part of his nose with it, and consoled herself with that image. The encounter had left Carson with a surplus of energy. It jolted through her, fighting to find any outlet to escape her skin. She attempted to ignore the tingling buzz at the back of her skull, shaking out her hands to try and dislodge the panic building in her limbs. This wasn't new behavior for her brother, and it had only increased in frequency in the past few months, but Carson couldn't deny his timing was impeccable. "Asshole!" she growled, blowing out a hard puff of air and picturing her tension being expelled along with it. 10 minutes of pacing and a scorching hot shower later, Carson was able to soothe her humming body enough to finally sit relatively still. It was nice to have finally gotten the grime of the court off her skin, and the day's events had almost washed away with the water. She settled into her nightly routine of working on schoolwork, hoping that would keep her mother satisfied enough to not barge in on her. She couldn't quite breathe easy, but the steel bands that forever encased Carson's ribcage had loosened considerably. Despite her mother's earlier comment, Carson had returned her hair to its usual braid. She wasn't sure if she did it out of comfort or spite, and she tried not to think about what that meant. At the very least, she could admit that not having the heavy brown curtains constantly in her face was one less distraction she had to worry about. Her shoulders tensed as she felt the mattress dip behind her. Carson didn't look up from her calculus even when her mother removed the elastic from her hair and began combing the damp strands with her fingers. It couldn't have been anyone else. Isaac didn't have a stealthy bone in his body, and he thrived on the knowledge that people knew he was watching, Carson's mom, on the other hand, had a bad habit of never knocking and appearing wherever she pleased. The annoyance Carson felt was far overshadowed by the dread curling its way around her throat. Her mother's touch was light, but it felt like a threat. "What did I tell you? You disobeyed me. Don't you want to be perfect?" "I'm sorry about earlier," her mother said softly, gently working through the knots Carson hadn't cared enough about to get rid of. "I know I can be a little hard on you. I just want to make sure you know someone's looking out for you." Carson tried not to sigh too audibly. If looking out for her meant controlling her every move, then yes, she believed her mother. Losing focus on her homework, Carson began to doodle tiny circles in the spaces between the words on her paper. "I know, Mom. And I'm sure your brother wants the same for you, too." Carson rolled her eyes. "Isaac wants to be entertained." As soon as the words left her mouth, a weight dropped into Carson's stomach. What was she thinking, saying things like that to her mother? Obviously, she wasn't thinking at all. Carson wasn't free yet, but apparently she'd already thrown her self-preservation to the wind. It had taken years for her to build up her shields, and now all that work lay in the gutter. And all because of one stupid signature and a stack of paper squirreled away right underneath her mother's nose. The fingers in Carson's hair continued to smooth away at the strands, but their movement became noticeably rougher with her unthinking statement. "You know Isaac cares about you," her mother said, in the same light tone she'd used before. "Brothers are meant to be protective." Carson stilled. She was no longer looking at her homework, but staring somewhere past it entirely. "If he cared, he'd know that I like my space." Was that a grave Carson was digging? She'd find out soon enough if she didn't shut up. A quiet horror was building in her gut, but it didn't seem to be doing anything to get her to stop saying things she shouldn't. "He was checking in on you. You walked home alone in the dark," her mother scoffed. "He was drunk!" Shit. The grip in Carson's hair tightened, sending pinpricks of pain skittering across her scalp. Carson squeezed her eyes shut, as if that would do anything to keep her from damning herself any further. If she pretended hard enough, maybe she could take back the words that hung like a noxious cloud between her and her mother. "Apologize," her mother said softly. Her voice was unnaturally calm, as if anger had the opposite effect on her than it did anyone else. She seemed composed, but Carson had heard that tone enough times to hear the slight waver all the way at the back of her mother's throat. "It's not like it's a secret," Carson whispered. She had already dug her grave. Her body had decided that she might as well lie in it, Carson guessed. Her mother gave Carson's hair a sharp tug, jerking her head back with the force. She could feel her heart racing, its pace sending waves of sound crashing through her ears. Carson held her breath, but the feeling in her chest and at the back of her throat didn't seem like fear. Not entirely, at least. For the first time in her life outside the court, Carson felt charged. It was as if she was facing down an opposing team, not her mother. Carson didn't know whether that feeling was thrilling or sickening. "Carson, now." Her mother's voice had reached a dangerously low pitch. Carson was in uncharted territory. At this point, she didn't know how to stop. "You saw him," she said through gritted teeth. The pull on her scalp was starting to give her a headache. "Carson Leanne James, you—" "Oh, stop lying to yourself!" Carson surprised even herself by bolting off the bed so suddenly that her hair ripped its way out of her mother's grasp. Hot pain lanced down her neck, but the relief that came after was almost worth it. "You keep pretending that we're a perfect family, but we're not. Anthony's gone. Isaac only ever cares about himself, and you—" A sting so sharp Carson couldn't quite decipher it heated her cheek in the silence that followed. Her mother's stone-cool expression had broken open into a wide, furious stare, but it shuttered closed so quickly Carson thought she'd imagined the change. This wasn't the first time Carson's mother had hit her, but it was the first time she actually seemed affected. In the 18 years she had lived with her, Carson didn't think she'd ever seen that facade shift before. It was terrifying. As if nothing had happened, Carson's mother turned and scooped a pile of envelopes off of Carson's bed where she'd been sitting moments before. She shoved the stack into Carson's numb fingers. "Take a look at those," she said. "I expect your decision by Monday." Then she left. For a while, Carson could do nothing but stare at the door she left open behind her. Her stomach was the thing that finally broke her out of her frozen, staring contest with the opposite wall. It gave a violent lurch, sending Carson into a mad dash for the bathroom. Time and memory blinked out of existence momentarily, and then she was on her knees. Carson's dinner ended up in the toilet, of course. So much for keeping some food down tonight. She'd lost her ability to breathe, and she was shaking so badly she was surprised to find that her atoms hadn't just come apart at the seams. The envelopes Carson had been holding were staring accusingly up at her from the bathroom tiles. She knew what they were. Of course she did. But she still took a peek down at them, once the retching and coughing had subsided enough for her to do so. Each slightly creased page sported the names of Colorado universities, all located within the Denver metro area, none of which fell outside a 25-mile radius from her house. Even if the bathroom were bigger than it actually was, Carson would still have felt pressed in by its walls. She stared, mouth dry despite the sour spit and bile that swam in her mouth. She barely registered the dull ache in her knees that warned of bruises to come. With shaking hands, Carson gathered up the letters one by one and considered tearing them to pieces. She imagined flushing them down the toilet, taking time to name each school as she did so before sending them down the pipes to mingle in the sewers with her vomit. Instead, she tucked them into a neat pile, quietly carried them all back to her room, and placed the stack beside her abandoned calculus homework. Carson threw herself into bed without bothering to get under the covers. Her damp hair fanned out around her shoulders. She ignored it. Her heart still rapped a frantic beat in her chest, filling the silence with a deep rush in her ears. She was too wired to sleep, but she stared up at the textured, peeling ceiling and willed herself to think of nothing at all. She wore her hair up the next day. This was Chapter 2 of Playing with Fire, and all for the game's story. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel. It's the best way for you to know when I update the story. To find a text version of what you just heard, you can find me on AO3 as Isles of Woe. Every chapter I complete is uploaded there as well. All of the art, writing, narration, and editing are done by me, so it takes me a while to get each chapter to you guys. But if you stay tuned, I promise you won't be disappointed. And please share this with your friends. For those who enjoy reading The Foxhole Court, this is for you, but I wrote this for newcomers as well. Thank you so much for listening. Bye!